Welcome to Walk With Me, where we journey with others through the challenges they've faced in their life and the lessons they've learned from them. Real people sharing their stories and the wisdom they've gained from a life well lived. And here's your host, Stephanie Bloom.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Can you please introduce yourself and the short title to your story?
Hi, everybody. My name is Jill Sitnick, and the short title to my story is Healing Childhood Trauma-Induced PTSD with MDMA Therapy, which is psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy.
Awesome. So I'm very excited to get into this, but Jill, tell me first, where does your story start? What was your childhood like, your family life like? What was your normal?
It's really interesting that you just asked what's my normal, because it's only in adulthood that I've understood that my normal was not everybody else's normal. My parents were not equipped to have children. They were absolutely traumatized on their own. It's taken me a lot of healing to understand that. So I was born into a family with a father who was a narcissist, who was abusive physically and mentally. And I was born into a family with a mother who was clinically depressed her entire life and tried to commit suicide multiple times throughout her life. And it wasn't until the age of 5 that she really took it seriously and tried to commit suicide with a shotgun. She survived, and then even additional times throughout her life continued that way. So my childhood from 0 to 5 was living with those two people, being routinely beaten, seeing my mother going through what she was going through. At that pivotal time at 5, when she tried to shoot herself, she survived. And so my rest of my childhood had a lot of upheaval with living with different relatives, going to different places. My father threw me out of his house at one point. My mother threw me out of her house at another point. So it was a rather disruptive. I like how you just said that my normal was abnormal, but I did not have a frame of reference to understand just how abnormal, and it didn't rear its ugly head for me to deal with it until my late 40s.
As is usually the case when we have tried everything else, we turn inward, right?
Very much so. I mean, there was really no other choice. My body made me very much aware there was a problem. So, yeah.
Okay, so when did you first start noticing that you had a problem?
Well, so my entire life, so I wound up leaving my father at 19. I went away for a year of college and didn't get beaten. And I was like, oh, this is what life is like. And came back. And within a week, he tried to start beating me again. And so I left him and got out on my own. Because obviously my mother was really not equipped even at that time to help out. And I wound up meeting a lovely man. I wound up living with my partner, Carl, for over 20 years. And what I've learned is that that loving relationship regulated my nervous system. I was always a type A, gung ho, got to get stuff done, always a little scared about safety and security, but I did not think that I was over the top. I just thought I was a normal type A person. And so at some point, my late 40s, Carl passes away unexpectedly. And about 18 months after his passing, my widow's fog started to dissipate. And suddenly I find myself getting triggered by a work email that, in terms of seriousness, was a 1, but I took it as a 10. I took a new work requirement as my life is coming to an end. I'm going to lose my job. I'm never going to be able to find another job. I'm going to lose my house. I'm going to be living in my car with my dog and bird, and that's all going to happen in a month. I was just 100% sure that was going to happen off of a work email about needing certifications. I mean, I laugh about it now, but at the time it was horrific. My body was just in a state of hypervigilance. I wasn't sleeping. My palms were sweaty. My stomach was upset. My shoulders were up to my ears. And After a couple of months of that, I went back to my therapist who had helped me with my grief work. I had treated myself to therapy to help me with my grief because that was such a new experience for me. And so I went back to her with these new symptoms of my body flipping out, me getting more and more depressed, me getting much more thinking about suicide and my own life, because if this is how life was going to be, if I was never going to feel safe, then what's the point of living? And so that's when I showed up on her couch again, started to go through some of this childhood stuff that my body was saying we need to deal with. And that's when she diagnosed me with the PTSD.
Wow. So at that point, had you had that conversation about your childhood with this therapist prior? Like, did she know?
No, our work had entirely revolved around the grief. And so and she'd always let me pick up and put therapy down whenever I wanted to. And this particular PTSD episode came after a period of where I had kind of put therapy down because I mean, life was good. I had a great job. I was working at Microsoft. I had a great house. It was almost paid off. The pets were, I was even in the second longest relationship of my life. Like everything looked good. And I show up on her couch and I'm crying and I'm freaking out over this work thing that, by the way, this is months after this work thing and nothing bad had happened. But yet I'm still in this doom spiral. And the most interesting kind of therapeutic process started because she said to me, well, it seems like your body's trying to tell us something. Let's figure out what it is. And I was like, what are you talking about, my body? And I was an English major, so I'll visualize and have fun with my imagination any day of the week. And so we started first talking to my shoulders, because I swear my shoulders were up to my ears my entire life, just very tense. And we started talking to my shoulders and asking my shoulders, why are you so tight? What's going on? And it almost immediately brought me back to the age of 10, hiding in my closet, afraid my father was going to find me. My shoulders were telling me I felt trapped and in danger. And that's when all of a sudden things started to open up for me, like, oh my gosh, my body is the path for figuring out what's going on here. That was really the process.
I think that's a huge shift for most Westerners because we spend so much time in our mental body that when our physical body demands attention, we're like, what is happening?
Yeah, we are not told about trauma. I didn't believe her. It's funny. I argued with my therapist when she tried to diagnose me with PTSD, and she said, look, I'm going to give you some homework because as a teacher, I understood homework. And she made me read The Body Keeps the Score. And suddenly I realized, as opposed to my behavior being a deficit that I wasn't good enough or smart enough to heal, I suddenly realized, oh, wait a minute. Everything I'm experiencing is normal. Trauma is in the tissues. And it really validated. And that's what made me believe her diagnosis and then ultimately decide to go for a treatment with psychedelic assisted psychotherapy.
So what treatments did you start with? Because I don't imagine that psychedelics was the first thing you went to.
Actually, in irony, it was second, I guess, to talk therapy. I had been, because of the depression from the grief, I had been on Wellbutrin for, I think, about 6 to 8 months at that point. So this PTSD episode happened while on that prescription. At that point, when I started seeing my therapist again, it was pure talk therapy. I wasn't depressed. It was pretty clear I was in a PTSD trauma loop, and there really is no specific medication for that other than talk therapy. So after a couple of months of talk therapy, whereas at one point, she literally said to me, Jill, I could see your grief healing happen. She could see that, her big view of it. She said, I'm not seeing you getting anywhere. And I think we need to look at this other healing modality. And she was in a program to become a psychedelic assisted psychotherapist. So she told me, go look at the research at MAPS.org, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. You're nodding your head. You know that site. It was new to me. I went to go look at the clinical research. They were on the phase 2 trials at the time that said 3/4 of the people who go through this therapy no longer qualify for a PTSD diagnosis. And she also assured me that it would be her working with me and her mentor, who was a medical doctor at the time. And so I would have medical grade MDMA. And I said, I'm getting the Cadillac of therapy opportunity here. Let's go. Because I really was getting to the point where I was not understanding that there was a point to live anymore. It was almost like I was running a race with a wild animal behind me, and I just couldn't outrun it. And I was just running and running and running and getting tired and tired and tired and just constantly feeling that there's this threat behind me. And it's very challenging to want to live in that situation. And that was ultimately the deciding factor. I talk in my book that I didn't tell people. I was pretty ashamed, but my therapist picked up on it when I said things like, I'm done. One more thing the universe does to me, I'm done. I'm out of here. And that was pretty clear language to her ears.
Okay, so what was your first experience with this psycho-assisted therapy like?
So MDMA is not your classic psychedelics for people who are new to psychedelics. It doesn't produce visuals. The street names are usually ecstasy or Molly. Unfortunately, too often they're cut with other things they shouldn't be cut with. So I had pure grade MDMA, meaning it was synthesized in the early 1900s. It wasn't cut with anything. And if you look at a psychedelic assisted psychotherapy session, like any other medical procedure, suddenly it's way easier to understand. So we had a couple of months of preparation. You're nodding your head. This is familiar to you. We had a couple of months of preparation. I asked every question I could ask because I had very little experience with, the drugs, the way we say it here, the drugs. I had very little experience. So I asked every single question. I went through all of my intentions. What did I want to heal? Pretty much, why was I so scared all the time? Then the actual day, the MDMA day, and I say day because MDMA journeys can last anywhere from 5 to 8 hours. So it's a full day. And then afterward, the integration. But that day was lovely. I got to sit with my guide and therapist in a lovely journey room that had seating areas and a mattress and blankets out the wazoo and water and snacks. It was like the best room ever. And after a little bit of talking about my intentions and making sure I had all of my questions answered, because trust me, I was asking every single question under the sun, I took the 2 MDMA capsules and proceeded to have a lovely journey where I finally heard my inner voice. And I was able for the first time to explain to 2 people without my body freaking out that I was 1,000% sure that if my father was in the room, he would be trying to kill me, probably have his hands around my neck. That was, for me, that journey day was kind of revolutionary.
Generally speaking, mother and father wounds are some of the most detrimental to our human existence, right? And because they are the 2 people you are supposed to be depending on for your life and well-being, and they abuse that status, it can mess you up so bad. Like the trauma responses that come from that oftentimes are that type A personality where you have to prove your worth because you were not worthy when you were a kid, and not being worthy meant you weren't safe, right? And so to go through this experience and work on that wound, it was no small feat for sure. So how long did your session last?
So that first session, actually, I think your intro here, you didn't realize this, but it was actually perfect for this question, because my inner children, that's the way I talk about myself, my inner children did not trust adults. And so a regular quote unquote medicinal MDMA journey can go as long as 8 hours. I shut mine down at hour 5. I was instantly awake. There was no gradual coming out of the enhanced state. It was like 1 minute I was in that state, the next minute I was done. And it was basically my doctor saying, you have some real strong fear issues. stemming from your parents. And so we now know we have a lot of work to do. I mean, my first journey was September. My second journey wasn't even until December. Like, we really took our time figuring out what was going on. We didn't get to the big wounds that you're talking about. The I'm not enough, and oddly enough, I'm too much, because like you said, toddlers can't handle the fact that their caregivers are abusing them. So I think from like 0 to 7, or 6, it's all about us. We're the sun of the universe. So if anything's happening, it has to be because of us. Those are the stories that we create. I had created, I'm not good enough to be loved. And weirdly, conversely, I'm too much. I'm too much of an inconvenience. I'm just too much to be loved. I had those parental wounds. They didn't come up until the third journey. So I think I deviated from your question. I apologize. Did I answer it, or do I need to go back? I think I rambled there. I'm sorry.
It's a wonderful conversation, and what you're sharing is beautiful. So thanks for taking us along on the journey.
Okay.
So that first session then really just kind of revealed what it was that you had to work on. And so you had subsequent sessions to help that process along.
Yeah. So I didn't understand as an adult where the fear came from. Like, I understood my father was a jerk. I understood my mother neglected me, but I didn't understand why, as a competent adult, those things were bothering me. Right. And so an hour and a half after that first journey, so I'm in the car home, my boyfriend's driving me home. And we lived all of a half an hour away from where this journey was. And I'm sitting in the car and I'm having this shame spiral that this didn't work, because you come out of an MDMA journey and very rarely are there fireworks. Like, and you don't really remember much. We actually recorded on our phones. There was a glitch in the second journey, but we recorded on the phone so I could have the whole transcript. So, 5 hours for me felt like 45 minutes. So I came out of it not really thinking anything had happened. And I was really kind of sad. I don't know what I was expecting, but I definitely expected something. Well, I'm in the car. I'm having this spiral of, I wasted everybody's time. I'm in inconvenience. I didn't do a good job. I'm not good enough. That whole thing. And suddenly, 3 childhood memories just kind of floated to the surface. And they were from after my mother had shot herself, and I was being shunted from relative to relative, because obviously she had to recuperate. My parents were getting divorced. I have no idea what my father was doing. I was just being thrown around. I probably lived with like 3 different sets of relatives. I don't even remember. Hence the feeling of, I'm not good enough for a family. I'm an inconvenience. I was always, the extra cot in the room, or getting the hand-me-downs and never really knowing where I was going to live. Like, I was an inconvenience. I waste everybody's time just by existing. And I'm seeing these memories come up, and I'm looking at them now at the time I was in my late 40s as an adult, saying, oh my gosh, I was not an inconvenience. I was a child that needed to be cared for. I just had 2 parents that couldn't care for me. That right there, that's the healing. That's what this medicine allows you to do. It allows you to reframe the memories. And I remember turning around to my boyfriend and saying, oh my goodness, I think I understand how this therapy works.
That's
And
hilarious.
that's what kind of happened. Like, especially the first couple of days, a lot of childhood memories came up, and I was just looking at them. And I'm holding, for people who are listening, I'm holding my hand kind of a little bit away from my face, because it was like I was looking at those memories like they were on TV, like they almost belonged to somebody else, because my body was not physically reacting to them in fear. I was able to just look at them objectively and say, hey, wait a minute. That 3-year-old didn't deserve to get beaten up by her 230-pound father. She deserved to be cared for. So that was the basic process. From the actual day of the journey, I felt like, and this is Jill's language, I felt like the medicine highlighted the memories that linked to the intentions about figuring out fear, that ultimately brought me these memories to reframe and to look at differently. So it was pretty fascinating.
I love how the process starts with you being brave enough to look at it, right? Like you have to be in a certain place. Some of us get there because we're forced to, right? Like we have some sort of physical ailment or some sort of like existential crisis, right? And it forces us to look at these things. Yeah. But the healing, as far as I can tell, is generally in looking at that situation from a different perspective and finding a different truth. It doesn't mean that it replaces the truth of the situation, but it means that there's also other players or other things to consider that you had absolutely no control over and were just a victim of circumstance, right? Yeah, like we usually play some part in our own trauma, right? Like you were born, you existed, right? That was no fault of your own.
I was there.
But you were there, right? And then these other people in your world, you know, didn't have healthy responses, didn't have healthy coping mechanisms, and it's trauma breeding trauma, right? So you being strong enough in your late 40s to look at your trauma and say, okay, this is enough. What's going on? That's the start of your healing.
Yes. And I think it's really important that you mention that because clearly you understand medicine work. So this is not turnkey. If this gets FDA approved in August, which I'm crossing my fingers and doing a dance to hope that I'm pretty optimistic, regardless of the news that's happening right now. People are going to be inundated with marketing, and I think it's really important to understand that this is not turnkey medicine. The psychotherapy portion is super important. People can absolutely go through a lovely MDMA journey and then go back to their regular lives and never spend any time meditating or journaling or being in art or being in nature, and never taking the opportunity to have those memories come up to heal. And they can just continue living their lives the way they've lived their lives. This therapy does require the same way. Think of it like physical therapy. If you have some sort of operation and you don't then strengthen the muscle or stretch the tendon or whatever, then you're really not going to be healing well. And it's the same thing here. You have to be willing to go towards the trauma. That year of healing was not fun. Some people complain that the book is kind of depressing. And I'm like, well, yeah, it was pretty hard work. So I'm really thankful that you brought that up. People have to be willing to put the work in. The medicine is just a tool. It is not the entire healing modality.
I'm excited to see Western lifestyle adapt the ideas and practices that were previously left to people who strictly deal in the spiritual realm. There's a reason why shamans are trusted with this process, because it's not just a show up, have a great time and go home situation. Like you need someone to walk you through it before, during, and after.
Very much so. If you want the most therapeutic healing, that's what you need. And there are some people who've read my book and they're just like, well, I'm just going to go take some MDMA on a beach. And I'm like, well, you can do that, but you're not going to have nearly as much progress as if you're not going to have as much progress experience, like if you had chosen to work with a therapist or someone very, very knowledgeable about medicine work, like somebody in the underground who's been doing it for 30 years. You'll have two completely different experiences.
Both of them provide opportunity for healing, and I'm excited to see that because MDMA therapy is so impactful. So how did your life change after you went through this year of healing? Or what were some of the highlights you want to share about that process?
About the healing process or about afterward? So I think what was interesting about the healing process was that the first two journeys were pure MDMA. My nervous system was so completely dysregulated that I look back, and I know there's a lot of people saying different medicines can also be used for PTSD, and that's absolutely sure, agreed. I think my diagnosis came probably a little closer to CPTSD, but we didn't use that language back then. And for me, with my nervous system the way it was, we really needed MDMA. What I think is interesting is that my first journey was September, my second journey was December. In March of the following year, I had a nightmare about being trapped as a 5-year-old in the house where my mother had shot herself. And I'm doing a lot of talk therapy with my therapist. I was an English major. I loved the visualization. We were really working to get me out of that house. And the door to that house in real life just didn't exist in my mind. I could not get out. And the windows, like, just couldn't get out. It was the weirdest thing. And so my second journey was December. My third journey was not until May, because in March, I have this nightmare. It's haunting me. My subconscious is basically knocking on the door. And my guide, my therapist and guide kind of talked together. And my guide said, look, you're clearly having a block. We're going to go with MDMA for your third journey. And he suggested, if we run into this block that seems really deep, we might want to add a little bit of psilocybin to that third journey. That's called a hippie flip. And at that point, I trusted my doctors. I was like, okay. And they predicted the future. That's what happened. Halfway through that MDMA journey, I still couldn't get out of the house. There was no door. They gave me a very low dose of psilocybin. And within an hour, my childhood home kind of just blossomed open like a big giant flower. It was actually all black, but like that's how it kind of blossomed open. And that house was no longer there. And in my subconscious, my little 5-year-old showed up in a garden. She was free of that house. I had a lot of integration work to do to really solidify that. But that healing experience, when I came out of that third journey and I remembered that, that's when I said I need to write the book and I need to be an advocate for this therapy, because that was the first time I actually felt like I was having healing during the journey. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like you throughout all of your sessions and therapy like talk sessions and things, you were processing, right? But you get to this last episode and it's a completely different perspective. Like going from this trapped house where I'm sure it was scary, nightmares have that tendency, right? But then you get to this visual where you see this beautiful flower, right? It's dark, but it blossoms, it opens, right? That's like what a visual for healing. And then just little Jill in a garden. That's beautiful. So, okay, so what happens with this, like in your personal life? Like, how does that change you as a person?
Oh my gosh. It made me, I should rephrase, it made me much less afraid. What I will say, because I don't want to have anybody get the wrong impression. At the end of the summer, so I had that third journey in June. At the end of that summer with that integration, because again, I had a lot of that processing with getting out of the house. I had to reinforce it a lot because our brains need repetition for learning. That's when I no longer qualified for a PTSD diagnosis. That didn't mean that all of my trauma was healed, because I was pretty much marinated in trauma and neglect. I like to say that this MDMA therapy healed the capital T traumas. That by that summer, I was no longer suicidal. I knew there was a future. I knew that the universe was, I didn't know if I necessarily trusted the universe as much as I knew the universe was not out to get me. And that's a big distinction. And so after those 3 journeys, about like 8 months later, I went back to my therapist and guide and said, I'm still having some fear remnants. Can we do another journey? But I'll tell you, that journey was psilocybin because my body was not dysregulated. I was not in a PTSD doom spiral. I was just aware in my ordinary life that I still had these like lowercase t traumas that were causing me some fear. And it was an interesting shift in medicine. And since then, I've continued I had 2 more journeys. So I had a total of 5 journeys with my therapist and guide. And then since then, I have been experimenting and learning about other psychedelics and how they work with trauma. And it's just absolutely fascinating. I'm still Jill in terms of who I am, my morals, my values, my work ethic, all the things I was afraid, like who's Jill going to be? What I'm not is powered by fear. I'm powered by excitement now. And that's a huge shift.
I love that a lot because I'm in that space where I wake up every day super excited about what I have on my plate. I cannot wait to get up, right? I have my miracle morning routine. I do these same things every day to set myself up for the best success. And then
Yeah.
just come what may. You know, I have a general idea of what I'm going to experience, but it's going to be awesome. And
Yeah.
then it's so much easier now to process the bad things when they happen because my body's not overstimulated. My nervous system is regulated. I have
Yep.
made time for downtime and relaxing and pouring into that parasympathetic state so that I get that opportunity.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you wrote the book, and what was something that surprised you about that process?
Uh, what was really surprising is that I wanted to write a book about this therapy. And so I wrote the book I joined Seth Godin's writing program to get some feedback early on to see if this was even a topic that people would be interested in. And I obviously got a lot of good feedback. And I tried to write the book having the medicine procedure as the protagonist, because that's really the story here. This therapy is so important. And I got immediate feedback on people not really understanding. And it was because I wasn't explaining my actual childhood stuff. And when I actually got a friend of mine with whom I had worked years ago in the English department as an editor, and I sent her a couple of first draft things. And her response was, look, I understand what you're trying to do, but you need to explain your childhood stuff and your shifts because people aren't going to understand reframing without you giving an example of a reframe. And so what was really surprising to me was how much of my childhood stuff I put in the book, because I lived in years feeling intense shame. People were going to know I was damaged if they knew how I grew up. So I didn't talk about my childhood, which, by the way, is another sign that you have PTSD if you never talk about your childhood. Both my parents had it. I don't know anything about their childhoods. And so I think that was really the most surprising for me, that I had to kind of share a lot of personal stuff in that book that Jill 2 years prior would have been horrified for people to know, but there was no other way to describe the therapy. And I think that's what kind of frustrates people. I get a ton of fantastic reviews on the book, but I do have a couple of people who are like, I don't know if I really get it because they didn't experience child abuse. And so they couldn't necessarily really understand some of the trauma that's in there. Like in their mind, they're like, well, of course it wasn't that way. Why didn't you see it? And I'm like, well, that's what trauma prevents you from seeing. So I think that was the surprising part, having to write about the childhood stuff, seeing people really align and grasp it, and then seeing other people like, what are you talking about? That isn't even a thing. I was like, oh, wouldn't it be nice to live in that world?
Yeah, definitely. No
Yeah.
trauma, but I
I think also when we experience these big T traumas and even the little T traumas, like when you are able to reframe it and get a different perspective, it provides a different level of understanding that you can then apply to your daily life, and you're better
Yes.
off for it. So
Oh
it's
my
a great
gosh.
opportunity for growth, but it kind of sucks to have it in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. Something happens during the day. Before my MDMA therapy, I would have been not even at a 10. I would have been at a 12 or a 15. Cortisol, fire alarms in my head. Now something happens, I might go to a 5, maybe I go to an 8, but I'm able to calm down way quicker than ever before. You can't live a life without emotion, without things happening, but your ability to react to it becomes much healthier after, in my case, MDMA therapy, because of my childhood background that would make my nervous system, freak out at the smallest things, because that's what happened when I was a kid.
I just want to take a minute to
Process that, Jill. You've been through a lot.
Well, you know what? You had to go through a lot, I guess, to have this healing experience and be able to, it puts me in a situation to be able to explain what this therapy is to folks. So I think that's maybe why I'm here.
Well, I mean, it's definitely
Relatively new to the medical scene for sure. I think they're finally catching on to things that the underground scene has had an understanding of forever into perpetuity, right?
Yes.
So I'm glad
Yes.
to see that it's going to be able to be more accessible to more people who, people who would look at that underground situation and say, oh no, never. It doesn't matter how good they say it is. I'm never going to do that. When it comes
Right.
from, a place of peer reviewed research and documentation, and they have more confidence in it. So it's going to be available to more people. It's going to bring about positive change for sure. The great thing
Yes.
about addressing your trauma is once you address it, you can then help others address it, but you also become more aware of how your actions affect other people, and you are less likely to inflict trauma on others also. So it's just good all around. And I think if anyone needs it, it's the world right now.
Yeah, I mean, learning about generational trauma, I never looked at my parents as people. My very first journey, my doctors asked me, my therapist and doctor asked me to bring pictures of my parents. And I didn't have any. The only thing I had was their wedding album, which is telling on one sense. And when they looked at these pictures of my parents, they saw two very unhappy people. And it was interesting suddenly looking at these very young parents. To me, they looked normal. It never even occurred to me. And to have these two other people give feedback and say, wow, they look like they're at a funeral. And I was like, oh my gosh, so does the family. Like, you could actually look at these wedding pictures that are supposed to be about joy and happiness and see sadness. And if anything is a indication of generational trauma, it was like right in front of me the whole time, and I never saw it just because I was so used to my parents never being happy. So it is, I didn't have children for a variety of reasons, not having a family structure, but also there was this knowledge in my head that I did not grow up with loving parents, and I had a concern about that. Oddly enough, I became a high school teacher and loved teaching and loved the kids. But it is a real interesting knowing your trauma, not inflicting it on others. That's how as a community we get better.
Yeah, I think a lot of the mental health issues that come from mental health issues are, preventable. If we can just have those cycle breakers step in and say, hey, wait a minute, that wasn't normal. Even if it's messed me up, I'm going to do my best not to mess other people's up. I'm going to try and talk about it and get this information out there. Hey guys, this isn't right. Not stopping in that pursuit of bringing attention to it. People, you
Right.
got to heal your trauma. We all have to work on it. Everybody.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to understand another great point you just made. Everybody has something. Don't discount your emotions, feelings, opinions, the stories that you've told yourself of, oh, I'm not good enough. Oh, I've got imposter syndrome. Like, whatever your stories are, and notice I say stories plural because we all have a bunch of stories. It doesn't matter if you had amazing parents, but your trauma came from a bully. Doesn't matter if you had an amazing life and your trauma came from being on the battlefield. Your trauma is your trauma. And getting healed and fixing those stories that we've told ourselves, go for it. Don't think the way that I did. I thought for so many years that, yeah, I had bad parents, but, I wasn't in the foster system, for instance. That used to be my go-to. Yeah, I had a bad childhood, but I wasn't in the foster system. So I don't have anything to heal or whatever. Don't do that to yourself. Really honor what you went through and don't compare it to anybody else, because everybody's trauma is individual, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And further, have grace for yourself. Like, the person you were then was going through some potentially heinous things and just doing the best you could. Like, your shoulders scrunching up, trying to protect you from something that's coming at you from behind, right? Like that, you carried that through your life for a long, long time until you understood why. Now your shoulders are nice and relaxed.
I know, right? Yeah, just kind of hanging out. Yeah. They haven't been up to my ears in years. Yeah.
That feels really good. I'm glad for that, Jill. Really.
Thank you. That's very kind. You are very knowledgeable in this subject too. So I think you get it.
I've been around the block a few times. All right, Jill. So what is your life like now? Like, what are you working on? Obviously, you have the book out. When did that happen?
2022, the book came out, and I wrote The Teacher in Me. I wrote an intention setting workbook because I went on a psychedelic retreat. I love psychedelic tourism. I love understanding how the different psychedelics work with trauma. And I found that some people were really disappointed in their experience, and it all came down to the preparation. They didn't really understand intentions. And so my intention workbook is that you get to sit with me and my therapist. These are the 8 different ways that my therapist and I worked on my intentions. And there's a free download on my website about the body, the one that we use the most. So if people are like, and this even works just for regular talk therapy, but if you want to like tap in and try to understand what your body's telling you, that prompt is really, really fun. And I created the YouTube channel because I did a TEDx talk about this therapy, and TEDx will not publish it because it was not FDA approved. And that irritated me enough that it caused me to start my own YouTube channel to create the content that I wish had been around when I was going through the therapy. So when people are like, well, how can I learn more about the therapy? I say, first, go to the clinical trials, go to maps.org, go look at the clinical trials. There's a journal, Nature journal has all of the actual research if you're really into all those numbers. So from a clinical side, that's that information. If you want to hear about it from a patient's point of view, go to my YouTube is The Journey Sage, because I wish there had been like a big sister to kind of explain what this therapy is and what I would be expecting and how to work with it. And that's what I've just tried to provide for other people. And that's what I do. And I get to talk to cool people like you on podcasts. I'm super looking forward to the FDA approving in August, and just being a resource to help people out. I think like in the future, it'd be awesome to do retreats. I'm in a coaching program. I'm in Third Wave Psychedelic Coaching Program to help people out. So I don't know what the future is going to be, but as long as I can in some way help folks understand this therapy, I'm a happy camper.
I love that. I think that's a wonderful purpose, to be someone who you wish you had, so that you're a guide for others, and being willing and open to connecting to people who have questions or want that support. I think that's a beautiful way to spend your time here. So thank you, Jill. I appreciate it.
Right? There are way worse ways to live, right? Yeah. Yeah, it's good. It's fun stuff. So I really appreciate people like you spending the time to talk about these things, because we all know psychedelics have a stigma and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, the focus on, in your instance, the suicide mentality with my mother, myself, you know, this is a healing modality. I wish my mother had had access to it. Her life could have been radically different.
I was a teenager. I was flirting with that idea of suicide myself. And in an underground situation, I had a psychedelic experience, and it cured me from that for the rest of my life. So I know it works.
Lovely. Oh, how lovely.
Yeah. So
yes, it does.
I'm super excited that other people will have access to this, because I know it works.
Yeah.
All right, Jill.
That was very brave of you to share. Yes, lovely.
Is there anything else you would like to share with the audience that we haven't yet touched on today?
You know, I would just say in the US, the FDA approval is coming. You're going to see, if you're starting to look at this, you're going to see a lot of negative, a little bit of positive. Like that's always what kind of happens before a major shift, kind of all the negative Nellies come out. And that's what's happening a little bit now. Ultimately, though, what I say to folks is that if you know that you've got PTSD or anxiety or depression, or you know somebody who does, take a minute and do a couple of internet searches around this topic, because there's a healing modality that can help a large number of people who, you know, don't have a history of schizophrenia and phobia. Like there's a large population that this can help. And keep an open mind, because you wouldn't want to prevent yourself or a family member from getting healed just because you think you know that drugs are bad. Keep an open mind, do some research, and be open to a different healing modality.
I love it, Jill. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It was a great conversation.